I thought it might be interesting to break down each scene from Dune Part 2. On the 4K Blu-ray disc, the movie is split into 16 different scenes. I'm going to be analyzing scene number 1, which is the first 9 minutes and 14 seconds of the movie. I'll be comparing it to the book, making guesses as to which parts from the book inspired the scene, how accurate it is to the source material, as well as giving my overall opinion of the scene. Keep in mind that I am very much a book fan, and while there are things I ultimately like about this adaptation, Dune Part 2 is not the adaptation I wanted, and so I will be critical of it. Personally, I feel like Part 1 was a much better adaptation and movie. I also do not think any of the major changes in Part 2 really benefited the film. So without further ado, let's get into it. Before the movie begins, we hear some sort of voiceover saying, "Power over spice is power over all." A bold way to open the film when the ending of this very film kind of contradicts this statement. But I'm getting ahead of myself. In the books at least, the statement is true because spice is the most important commodity in the known universe. The guild uses spice so that their navigators are able to safely fold space due to the prescient nature of the spice. Similar to how we see Paul's prescient vision of the future, the guild navigators, who in the books literally bathe in the melange, are able to use a more limited prescient vision to safely navigate ships. The spice is also taken as a recreational drug by the upper and middle class, as well as for its health benefits and ability to extend one's life, retaining a more youthful appearance. In the book, the Emperor himself takes the spice and is able to have the appearance of a 35-year-old despite being 72. The only problem is, once one is addicted to the spice, they must continue to take it, for withdrawal is fatal. I like the addition of this pre-introduction to the movie. It drills home the importance of spice to the audience. I just find it odd that the movie itself doesn't seem to. The film officially opens with Princess Irulan reciting one of her journal entries, which acts as a sort of recap to Dune Part 1, saying how,
Imperial Diary, year 10,191, third comment. The battle for Arrakis took everyone by surprise. There were no witnesses. The Harkonnen operation was perpetrated overnight, without warning or declaration of war. By morning, the Atreides were no more. All died in the dark.
During this monologue, we see the aftermath of House Atreides with the burning of bodies and an Atreides flag. We then transition to our first glimpse of the Emperor playing Cheops, or pyramid chess, on House Carino's home planet of Kaitain. Irulan continues her diary entry saying how,
The Emperor said, "Nothing. Since that night my father has not been the same, nor have I. His inaction is difficult for me to accept, for I know he loved Duke Leto Atreides like a son. But my father's always been guided by the calculus of power. This would not be the first time the Harkonnens have done his dirty work."
Implying to the audience his involvement. During this section we see the burning of a portrait of the late Duke Leto, as well as a shot of the Beast Raban being anointed to be in charge of spice production on Arrakis by the Baron Vladimir Harkonnen. She finishes by saying,
In the shadows of Arrakis lie many secrets, but the darkest of them all may remain. The end of House Atreides.
During this, we get a flyby shot of the planet of Arrakis with its 2 moons on the verge of creating an eclipse that we're about to see firsthand in this next section, and the title appears, Dune Part 2. So I think this opening does a fairly good job of reminding the audience of what has just transpired, as well as acting as an introduction to House Carino with Shaddam IV, Emperor of the known universe, and his eldest daughter, the Princess Irulan. I think Florence Pugh is an odd casting choice for Princess Irulan, but it works well for this interpretation, which is a more grounded, thoughtful, and in-control Irulan. Although I don't think I prefer it over Book Irulan, who is more haughty, vain, emotional, and manipulative. This Irulan, though, I think is supposed to overshadow the Emperor and guide him for the Bene Gesserit sisterhood, of whom Denis Villeneuve has brought to the forefront of his adaptations. The Emperor himself, played by Christopher Walken, to me is a very strange choice. He is a feeble-looking Emperor who acts at the end of his reign. He lacks any on-screen power and is just sort of there. But I guess it makes sense if you want the sisterhood to be more manipulative of his actions. I don't completely hate the change, assuming that they can do something interesting with Irulan in the next film that doesn't irritate me. It does, however, come at the expense of the ruler of the known universe feeling like a pushover, which in turn hurts the finale of this film, in my opinion. Irulan's dialogue in this section I feel is a bit needlessly cryptic, and almost contradictory. She says how her father's inaction is difficult for her to accept, which makes sense if she wasn't aware that he played a hand in the Atreides' downfall. But the very next line she admits to knowing, or at least assuming, the Harkonnens did his dirty work. She also says how he loved Duke Leto like a son, but gives no hint as to why. And I'm not entirely sure what the final line is really trying to say. In the shadows of Arrakis lie many secrets, but the darkest of them all may remain. The end of House Atreides. My best guess is she is hinting that her father's involvement will remain a secret, but I kind of think it was mostly put in because it sounded cool, which is my problem with most of the dialogue. It seems to favor sounding cool over actually being clear and informative, which a journal entry probably should be. So in the books, the Emperor shares distant blood ties with the Duke Leto, who is his cousin. The Emperor is fond of Duke Leto's moral code and charismatic leadership, but he also feels threatened by it and fears the army Duke Leto is building has the potential to be stronger than his own Sardaukar army. The Emperor works with House Harkonnen in secret to dispose of House Atreides. No one is to know of House Carino's involvement, and House Harkonnen pays an exorbitant amount of money to ship in legions of the Emperor's Sardaukar force to Arrakis disguised as Harkonnen soldiers. Dr. Yui is the Baron's personal traitor that brings down the protective shields and feeds information for the attack. Obviously, as we know, Yui double-crosses the Baron and attempts to kill him after the invasion, saving Paul and Jessica to clear some of his conscience. I don't want to dive too deep into this because I will be in a much later scene, but I want to point out that in this movie we find out that Helen Mohayim convinced the Emperor to do away with House Atreides, which is a direct contradiction to something she says in Part 1, so just keep that in mind. Another thing to take note of is that House Carino is known for their decadence, which is a bit opposite of how they are portrayed in the film as more minimalist. Now I will say that virtually none of this next section happens in the book and is very much just inspired by it. Directly after the title screen we are shown the fetus of Alia growing inside Jessica's womb, with Paul offering dialogue toward his unborn sister, before awakening from his trance on the sands of Arrakis.
Father is dead. Shouldn't you go back to the stars? Be with him? I'm afraid I won't have enough time to fix things before you're coming. This world is beyond cruelty.
Opening with the fetus of Alia is a bold choice, and once again the dialogue here feels a bit needlessly vague. Essentially, Paul is telling Alia to go back to their dead father in the afterlife, or before life in Alia's case, but also that he doesn't think he can correct everything done to their family before her arrival. So I'm not sure why Paul has to tell her to go back when she hasn't even arrived yet, and he knows this because he wants to correct the world before she does arrive. Once again, the dialogue feels a bit contradictory, but it sounds cool, so it's all good, right? From a book perspective, this communication with his sister could be inspired by a section in the book where Alia, after being born, is able to leave a sort of prescient voice message for Paul through time, as well as having a sort of connection to Paul.
I have breasted the future to place my words where only you can hear them. Even you cannot do that, my brother. I find it an interesting play, and oh yes, I've rid us of our grandfather, the demented old Baron. He had very little pain.
We then see Paul awaken from his trance and immediately see the effects of the eclipse taking place on Arrakis with a burnt orange color grading effect. Paul is then shushed by Chani as he lays on a sandhill with the rest of the band of Fremen shortly after the duel between Paul and Jamis. We instantly see one Fremen run off alone, possibly carrying a thumper. Shortly after, Stilgar tells Paul and Jessica to stay put as he and the band of Fremen leave, presumably to get into a position to eliminate the threat. It should be noted that the Fremen do break off into two separate groups. One group with Chani goes in a similar direction as the first Fremen, and Stilgar and the rest run off in the opposite direction. Stilgar does appear to cock his weapon before leaving, I believe indicating that his group will be shooting from a vantage point, while Chani's group creates the thumper distraction. We then see Paul and Jessica crawl up the hill and see the threat, which is a group of Harkonnen soldiers deploying from their dropship. This is when we first get a glimpse of the suspensor-like technology slowing the Harkonnens' fall to the ground. Being able to use suspensors to slow a fall is accurate to the book. An example of this is in a later scene from the book. Thufir Hawat sees a band of Sardaukar fall from a cliff face slowly with the use of suspensor technology. Similarly, the Baron uses suspensors to assist with his excess weight, or in the case of the films, literally levitate upwards. The levitating Baron is not a new concept, as it acts as a subtle nod to the original 1984 Dune film, in which the Baron could also levitate. Jessica then presumably uses a form of Atreides battle language to indicate to Paul to go down and to the right, and the two leave Jameis's body behind, wrapped tightly to preserve his body's moisture. Paul and Jessica take cover below a cliff face, and we see Jessica clutch at her stomach, reminding the audience of her pregnancy. The Harkonnens come over the hill and find the body of Jameis in some recently disturbed sand. One of the Harkonnens says how they're close, and we see one Harkonnen soldier follow the disturbed sand directly toward Paul and Jessica and begin to draw his blade. We then see what appears to be Paul picking up a rock in preparation of a fight or possibly a distraction. Before finding them though, we hear a distant thumper set off presumably by the first band of Fremen. The Harkonnen soldier returns to his group and they say, "Did you hear that? The rats are calling a worm." We then hear the Harkonnens shout out, "Worms! Unit, climb now!" The Harkonnens then proceed to use their suspensor technology to float very effectively up the tall cliff face Paul and Jessica are hiding under. This ability is cool, but I'm not sure how I feel about the repercussions of such a technology. It feels overpowered for warfare and also could make the potential rock climbing scene in a God Emperor of Dune adaptation feel out of place. The suspensor technology in the books does allow for objects to be suspended, hence the name, but I'm not sure there is any indication that it could be used to fly up a cliff face. However, seeing how the film has already established the Baron can sort of fly around, it is reasonable for the film version. Once at the top, we see the Harkonnen scope out the thumper and shoot it out with what appears to be a rifle version of a laser gun. One Harkonnen then calls out to look for worm signs as we see the eclipse go into full effect. He then says, "We're okay," right before a Fremen projectile, which may or may not be a laser gun, takes him in the head, killing him instantly. Another Harkonnen sees it and shouts out, "Shields!" while yet another Harkonnen counter calls him saying, "No shields." The projectile weapons continue taking out the Harkonnen soldiers on the high ground, one after the other. We see a Harkonnen body fall from the cliff face, narrowly missing the now fleeing Paul and Jessica. Bodies continue falling around Paul and Jessica, and one lone Harkonnen soldier uses his suspensors to safely fall in front of them but facing the opposite direction. He draws his blade and slowly walks forward. Another body falls behind him, and the impact causes him to whip around and spot Paul and Jessica. Paul dashes for the blade of the nearby body and uses it to dispatch the Harkonnen soldier. We then see a different Harkonnen appear over the hill and slowly draw his gun on Paul, saying how, "I got you, rat," before Jessica cleaves him in the back of the head with a large rock, and once he falls to the ground, she bashes his head in with it, killing him. Paul then drops the Harkonnen blade as Jessica chastises him, saying, "Never stand with your back towards the open. How many times do I have to tell you that, huh?" Paul responds with, "You okay?" And Jessica says, "Yeah." Paul then says, "How about her?" gesturing towards his unborn sister. Jessica says she's fine, and the scene ends with the eclipse pulling apart. To me, this dialogue from Jessica felt a little bit hostile, but it wasn't too out of place. Okay, so if you turn off your brain and just watch this scene unfold, it's a spectacle. As soon as you start to actually think about it though, it falls apart to an almost embarrassing degree. Firstly, I do want to give credit for the visuals. Denis has a very distinct style, and his version of Dune does have its own vibe. The idea of having it take place during an eclipse was a stylistic choice, which I think works. Now, the actual logic of the scene doesn't work, for me at least. The scene starts with the Fremen band leaving the body of Jameis behind and Paul and Jessica. Why? Honestly, I can't think of a single reason to leave them behind, aside from maybe the Fremen were using them as bait without telling them, which seems cruel. The second group of Fremen apparently are able to find a very nice vantage point, while the first group I assume set off the thumper to force the Harkonnens to some form of action. They choose to take the high ground, which makes sense to avoid any potential worm, on top of them having long-range laser guns. They then proceed to stand straight up, nice and tall, so the Fremen can pick them off easily from their amazing vantage point that we are never shown. We're also never shown what kind of weaponry the Fremen are using to effectively snipe the Harkonnens. When Stilgar left, he appeared to have cocked a Mala pistol, which doesn't account for the ranged laser gun looking shots killing the Harkonnens. Mala pistols have a relatively short range, and in the books shoot a poison dart. After the first Harkonnen soldier falls, they don't react by taking cover or dropping to the ground, despite having high ground advantage. Instead, they continue to stand up, nice and tall, and debate on turning on their shields, which as a book reader we know is a bad idea if the Fremen are indeed using laser guns, which is a bit unclear. If a laser gun interacts with an active shield, it creates an unpredictable explosion that can be as dangerous as atomics, and always results in the death of the shield bearer and shooter. Ultimately, the Harkonnens wisely choose not to turn on their shields. So, despite having high ground advantage and long-range weaponry, the Harkonnens are easily picked off, and we are never shown any close-up shots of them shooting back at their attackers. Instead, the only two Harkonnens who survive jump off the front of the cliff face, which appears to be in the direction they are getting sniped from. The first lands on the ground and slowly pulls out a blade. Why? I have literally no idea, because he knows he's getting sniped from far away. But wait, when he conveniently turns around and spots Paul, he is now ready for this duel. We see Paul kill him, which makes sense, except that Paul is still new to killing, with Jamis having just been his first kill. After the fight, Jessica dispatches the other Harkonnen with a rock. It's a bit unclear why Jessica ran up the hill rather than assisting her son. I can only assume she saw the other Harkonnen soldier drop down. Now it's a bit strange that Jessica kills him with a rock when earlier we saw Paul reach for a rock. There's nothing necessarily wrong with this, but if it was foreshadowing for this moment, it makes more sense to see Jessica be the one to reach for the rock originally. Now after the fight, we see Paul drop the Harkonnen blade, which also doesn't make much sense. We literally just saw both him and his mother without a form of weapon, and once they have access to weapons, they don't bother looting any and actually discard the weapon Paul just used. I guess what's annoying about this scene to me is how it was obviously inserted for some sort of action right off the bat, but it wasn't actually well thought out, in my opinion. I'm sure plenty of you have played games like Warzone or Apex Legends and know that if you have high ground advantage, you would use the cover to your advantage to head peek your enemies and actually shoot back. And if you choose to jump off from height, you wouldn't do it directly in front of their line of sight. This is kind of just common sense to not get shot. Obviously, the Harkonnens weren't looking to get the dub. Now, going back to the argument as to what type of gun the Fremen are using, the only possible indication we have that they aren't using laser guns is during an upward camera angle shot we have looking at the scene from Paul and Jessica's perspective. We see primarily blue, I'll call them laser rifle shots, but if you pause the film, there are shots being fired with a very small red trail. It's feasible we are supposed to believe all the blue trails are the Harkonnens while the red are the Fremen. Okay, so let's go with that for a minute. This creates a different problem. I mentioned earlier how I thought it was wise for the Harkonnens to not turn on their shields if they were getting shot by laser guns due to the atomic-like explosion which would kill them all. I was like, oh, okay. They realize the Fremen are using laser guns and don't want to insta-die. Now, if this isn't the case, and the Fremen are using a different projectile weapon, then the only other reason to countercall the shields being activated is that it can cause nearby worms to go into a killing frenzy. This is an established piece of information from Part 1 as well as the book. In this scenario though, it would be beneficial for the Harkonnens to call in worms and be shielded from the Fremen projectiles. The worms, in theory, would kill or disperse the Fremen shooting at them, and the Harkonnens have the safest spot from the worms being hundreds of feet up on a cliff face. Not to mention we just established their suspensors allow them further protection with their ability to fly above the ground. I guess what bothers me is that this entire scene feels like it was inserted for the sake of some action. In order for this scene to work, it feels like the weaponry is intentionally hidden from us, and we are just supposed to believe the Harkonnens are deathly afraid of worms and would rather get shot despite being in a seemingly safe location from the worms. The closest scene from the book this could be pulling from is a scene where Paul and Jessica are running away from Harkonnen soldiers using laser guns in the desert from a thopter to try and root them out. Now, I will say that this first movie scene does show us the effects of Fremen desert power in action, showing us why Duke Leto wanted to recruit them prior to his death. I just wish this desert power was displayed in a way that made more sense. Someone could try and argue that the shield to laser explosion isn't a thing in the films, since I don't believe it's ever explicitly stated. I will argue in a later scene though why this doesn't appear to be the case. Not to mention a lot of the stuff in Part 1 makes this seem like it's not the case. Ultimately, this first scene is an exciting intro for Dune Part 2 that is held back by some vague, contradictory dialogue and an action scene that seems to have been crafted with too much time being spent thinking about style over logic. If you watch the scene with your brain turned off, it is a spectacle, but I can't help but wonder if these 9 minutes and 14 seconds could have been used more productively. Am I way off base in my thoughts on this intro, or did you notice something I missed? Let me know in the comments below. I will continue making these scene breakdowns along with other Dune and related sci-fi fantasy content, so consider subscribing to the channel. Until next time.